As we said, we are studying this morning in Romans chapter 14. Kind of the theme of this chapter, the theme that we had last week, is dealing with some differences. And we discussed in some detail how that as a congregation in Rome, that you had many people from different cultures, different countries, different backgrounds, different social standings, all of that converging on into this capital city. And so definitely there in Rome, you're going to have people that have different ways of thinking. And then we looked at even at our congregation here, how that even among us, we have a varied group of people. And there are people from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, as well as different social, different racial backgrounds. All of those things come into play when we're talking about working together and really thriving as a congregation. And that is really the key, I believe, there. A congregation maybe can exist and maybe no big problems come about, but we as a congregation, we don't want to just exist. We want to thrive. We want to grow, and we want to be a productive congregation. And so in doing that, as you do more, then these differences are going to come into play more and more. And so we have, some differences at Rome, at the Roman congregation there, and mainly it was between the Jews and the Gentiles. And so we're looking at chapter 14 and seeing what we can learn and as far as apply to us today as we study this chapter. Kind of the key passage there, and we looked at this last week as well, would be verse 19. And that passage there says, "Therefore let us pursue the things which make for peace, and the things by which one may edify another." And so we are pursuing things which make for peace. And our goal in doing this is not to promote maybe our own personal agenda, not to promote ourselves or to put ourselves on a pedestal, but we're looking and seeking to edify each other. I need to be seeking to edify each one of you, as well as everyone in this congregation needs to be doing the same and seeking to strengthen and edify and encourage each other. And so this is the goal, or one of the goals that we have as a congregation, and to do these things, as well as to promote the gospel and to preach and do other things like that. But one of the key responsibilities we have as a church is to strengthen and edify each other. And so we're looking at how we can do that when we have these differences. One thing we need to point out, and we didn't mention this last week, and I think it's essential, I guess, when we look at this chapter, is that chapter 14 really applies to issues of a personal nature. And these are issues which are related to a personal conscience. And so this is kind of a personal chapter. This chapter does not deal with collective problems. And so it's not dealing with maybe a collective problem that a church has as a whole. We're looking at personal consciences. We're looking at personal problems, things going on mainly between individuals. And so what happens a lot of times today is that, people try to solve maybe a church-wide problem or a collaborative problem, a collective problem with this chapter. And that's not really what's going on here. That's not really what Paul is dealing with. He's dealing with personal issues, not collective issues. And so what happens, like we said a lot of times, is that people, they will try to take Romans chapter 14 and solve a collective problem. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we proceed in our study. But that's one thing I think we need to keep in mind as we go through this study, is that we're dealing mainly with personal issues here in this chapter. And so we need to look at that, as we study this, we need to study it through the lens of personal issues here, and not necessarily trying to solve collective issues. We looked last week about what was at stake. And this is a good question we need to be asking as far as when we look at these issues. And we saw that the issues that were being discussed are not issues that are a matter of sin. Mainly, we're dealing with the eating of meats and the keeping of days. And of course, this had to do a lot with the old law and the Jews wanting to continue to do that. I wanted to still continue to withhold eating certain meats, or wanted to continue to keep certain days that they did under the old law. And the Gentiles thinking that there was no reason in doing that. And so you had both of these two people, thinking the other was sinning by doing that. And we need to, again, look at the context. Yes.
I'm not questioning anything. Where are you getting Jews was doing something and Gentiles was thinking something? Where is that context is what I'm trying to...
Well, the Jews, historically were, keeping the feast and restricted diet, where the Gentiles were not. Now, maybe I'm doing wrong by saying Jews versus Gentiles, but when you look at that, that's where I get that, just reading through that. I mean, do you disagree with that?
I don't see, all I see is a brother, which is very applicable to us. Jeremy's vegan. When I met them and he went vegan, one of the things I made clear in studying with him is that can't bind this because meats are allowed. Now, he wasn't trying to. He understood it. But I wanted to make them things clear, and I appealed to the very words that Paul used. And the point I'm making is I don't see any Jewish whatevers outside of the fact of just here's a person that might try to bind a certain day, or here's somebody against eating meats, and that's all I guess I'm just trying to.
Well, there again, I mean, you look at Acts, and there was a lot of issues in Acts as far as keeping the days and the meats and things like that. Now, there again, maybe I'm, reading too much into this chapter, but to me, when we're looking at those issues, it seems to be historically an issue between Jews and Gentiles. The Jews wanting to keep the days and not eat the meats, where the Gentiles are not.
I'm not being argumentative about it. You've been real careful. That chapter has to be framed correctly, just for the very reasons you're talking about. Throughout your studying with people, just only say what that text says.
Yeah.
Let him who is weak in the faith. That's all that chapter's talking about.
Yeah, and you're probably right. I mean, we need to be very careful because you do get out and
doctrines entering in that aren't under consideration.
Yeah.
All that's talking about.
Yeah.
Like you said.
So like you said, we need to keep it on a personal basis, and that was one thing I was trying to stress, and probably Jews and Gentiles aren't mentioned here, but that's a good point there. Anybody have anything they would like to say about that? What? Vegetarian. Okay, he's a vegetarian, not a vegan.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
We covered that to make sure brethren didn't get clear when we had a brother that wasn't trying to find anything, just his personal thoughts on an issue.
So we need to look, there again, these issues were not a matter of sin, it was a matter of choice. And when you read into the context and you've got to apply all this in context and talking about love and appealing to the gospel. I mean, you look at, even the entire context of the book of Romans, what is the theme there? The gospel is the power to save. It's not these other things. It's not the keeping of meat or the eating of meats, the keeping of days. It's the gospel. And so that's the theme of the chapter. Really the entire book is we need to rely upon the gospel. And so we need to look at the context and look at it, and before we start trying to pull verses out of chapter 14 without really applying the entire context. And so when we look at all that, we see that Romans 14 does not condone any doctrinal falsehood. We're not trying to condone anything that goes against the gospel. We're trying to uphold the gospel, not, propagate any doctrine that is contrary to the gospel of Christ. We're not trying to excuse someone who is practicing sin. We're not trying to say, well, he looks at it that way, he's got his right to, if that's what he wants to do, then we can't really say anything about that. That's not what this chapter is doing. We're not excusing someone. And we're not trying to treat any deviation from the Scripture as inconsequential. This is of no consequence if he wants to do that, because this is what Romans 14 says. That's not what Paul is doing here. We're not dealing with sin here in the sense of, you do what you want to do, I do what I want to do, and we're all going to be all right. Now we're dealing with differences that have no consequence as far as, our salvation. And so we looked at that last week in some more, or in deeper detail there. As we said, there are some who try to use this chapter to excuse all manner of sinful behavior. Often it's used in reference to something that God either requires or either He forbids. And people are trying to use this chapter to excuse those things. It's been used to justify adultery. And we have brethren who are trying to do that, justify adultery, with Romans chapter 14. You have one person who takes one position on adultery. You have another person who takes another position. And some want to go to Romans chapter 14 and say, well, let's just agree to disagree. And we can't do that on an issue like adultery. Adultery, the Scriptures are plain when it comes to adultery. The Scriptures are plain when it comes to marriage and divorce. And so we can't go there and say, well, Romans 14 gives us, the right or the justification just to say, okay, let's just agree to disagree. Y'all come on in here and we'll just all live happily. That's not what we're doing with Romans chapter 14. And so we need to understand that. God has a position on adultery. At this point, God doesn't really have a position on the eating of meats. He says, do what you want to do. But on adultery, He has a position. And so where God has a position, we can't then go in and say it doesn't matter. And that's what people are trying to do with Romans chapter 14 today. Yes, sir.
God does have a position on eating meats. Correct.
Okay. What would that be?
All meats are fine to eat.
Yeah. I thought that's what you were getting at.
And it's a weak brother that we're protecting here. We don't want him to violate his conscience and eat and be, therefore, what is not a faith is sin. So he has a position on meats.
Yeah, his position is they're okay. But if I wanted to refrain from eating meats, say like Jeremy, then I'm okay in doing that as well.
That's true. But
for non-religious reasons.
I would say, and I didn't quite hear what Jeremy said, but I doubt that this chapter has anything to do with Jeremy. Because I would say that Jeremy does not believe it's sinful to eat meats.
Yeah, that's
so
correct.
It's not applicable to Jeremy at all. This is about someone who has weak in faith and does not understand that God has a statement or a truth about eating meats. It's all right to eat meats, but we follow the text here for the sake of the weak brother. I'd also like to add that with time, we need to try to help that weak brother understand the truth.
Yes.
But we never do it to the point that would cause him to violate his conscience.
Yeah. And
but anytime we're weak in any point of the Scripture, we need to try to help that person. If I'm weak in a point, someone needs to try to help me, but not to the point that I would violate my conscience by doing something that I'm not convicted is right.
All right. Anything else?
You're probably getting this, but it's kind of because you're talking about adultery. God has a position on it. In your words, to most Christians, that's clear to us, and I don't know Christians that would have a problem with that. But what if it's an issue like, and again, we'll probably consider this later, like a woman working outside the home, okay? Take an issue like that, and we're going to get into the fact that, that if you're going to do something that's going to offend the conscience of another, then maybe you should refrain.
Yeah.
If he can, and you can get into this later, but just to put it on the table, might he consider something like, is he considering things of that nature? Not just liberties, because even if you looked at that person who obviously sees it as a liberty, if a woman thinks they can work outside the home, she obviously sees it as a freedom that she can do it or she cannot do it.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is, even in her case, it seems like to me that this would apply to her, because, but she could also affect the conscience of other women or Christians or young, whatever it might be. Wouldn't this apply to her?
I think,
you don't have to,
yeah, I'm not necessarily prepared. I don't want to say anything that I would regret later, but maybe. So, and things, not necessarily there, but I can see other instances as well. And I think you kind of hit on something there as far as, I think a lot has to do with attitudes and willingness to study and, things like that as well when you go into that. But that's a good point. And there may be others who would like to comment on that. And once we kind of get down to it, you can be thinking about it, or even next week, we can look at that there.
I wanted to comment on something that Gerald said. Jeremy was the strong brother. The weak brethren was the brethren we were dealing with at the congregation, trying to make sure that everybody understood how to conduct themselves in relationship to the being a vegan, not practicing something unless you're absolutely sure about it. Jeremy wasn't the weak brother, he was the strong brother.
Okay. All right, so when we look at here in chapter 14 what the real problem was, we need to get at, well, there was an issue here, so we need to find out, well, what was the real issue. And so what we have here are attitudes about inconsequential differences. We have differences in the way maybe we want to conduct our personal lives where, the gospel really has no bearing on that. It doesn't forbid, or, we're at liberty to do those things. But we have different ways of viewing these things, and maybe some here are then trying to bind those freedoms on others. And so that was these attitudes and these restrictions that were being placed are coming about because of these individual differences. And you look at the results of the attitudes there in verse 3. It says, "Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him." And so here you have someone despising someone, and then someone who is judging someone. Obviously, this judgment here, we understand that we do have rights to judge in certain ways, but the judging here obviously is not great, is not good, is not condoned, because it's being condemned, it seems. And so you have this despising and this judging going on here. In verse 10, it says, "But why do you judge your brother? Or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ." And so we have this contempt, we have this judgment, we have this person despising the other. And really, like we said, all of this is going back to the attitudes and on these differences that are inconsequential when it comes to the gospel. The words despise and condemn and contempt, they both go back to the same root word. And when you look that word up in Strong's, it says to set at naught, contemptible, to make of no account, despise utterly. And so we have some pretty nasty things going on because of these differences. We have some bad attitudes being shown here, to throw out as nothing. And so, here, this idea of holding this or showing contempt, despising, throwing this brother out, as nothing, treating him as nothing, some very bad attitudes there. You look at verse 15, it says, "Yet if your brother is grieved because of your food, you are no longer walking in love. Do not destroy with your food the one for whom Christ died." And so here, we have a brother that, feels so strongly about maybe his right to do these things that he's willing to destroy this other brother because of that. And this attitude of love, we talked a good bit about love a couple of weeks ago. And the attitude of love was not there in any of this. It looks like maybe on either side, because you had some on one side and some on the other that were being pretty selfish in this instance there. So the problem wasn't the differences. It seems the problem was the attitude about the differences. It was okay that one wanted to eat meat and the other one didn't. It was okay that one wanted to keep the days and someone else didn't. It's the attitude about either side. One side had against the other had it was the attitudes. That was the problem. It wasn't where we're not talking about sin. We're not talking about, the gospel or the doctrine being destroyed. We're talking about using liberty to destroy individual Christians, or that being a result. Maybe that wasn't the goal, but the result was that they were using their liberty to destroy other Christians. And they didn't really understand what was at stake there. Does anybody have anything they'd like to say about that? I think you're right. The stronger Christian has a greater responsibility there. And so we look at what the attitude should have been. What should have been the attitudes? And there we go back to verse 15 that we just read. If a brother is grieved because because I'm eating this food, because I'm eating this unclean meat, this meat that he considers unclean, then what should my attitude be about that? If I'm seeking, or if he's being destroyed, and that word is used, if I'm destroying this brother because I'm eating, pulled pork sandwich, what should my attitude be? Now, I like a pulled pork sandwich, but my attitude should be that I will refrain from doing that in order to not destroy my brother. Now, like Gerald said, it doesn't mean that I can't study with him, that I can't help him grow so that he understands that good barbecue is okay. But until he reaches that understanding, then I need to be very careful about what I do. You look at verse 13, "Therefore let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fail in our brother's way." And so there again, we're not going to put this stumbling block in the way of our brother, and we're going to be looking at that in a little more detail as we talk about the conscience here in just a few minutes. But we need to have this attitude that I'm not, if my pork sandwich is going to put a stumbling block, if it's going to be a stumbling block, then I need to get rid of that. I need to refrain from doing that. And there again, like Terrell said, the stronger brother has more responsibility. Verses 19 and 20. "Therefore let us pursue the things which make for peace, and the things by which one may edify another. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. All things indeed are pure, but it is evil for the man who eats with offense." So like we said, all things are pure. God has stated that very clearly. But yet, let's not use that freedom to give offense to another brother or sister. Yes.
In the instance of let's just use the eating meats, is the brother who believes that and understands that it's okay to eat meats, should he refrain from that only when he and the weaker brother are sharing a meal together, or should he refrain from it no matter where he's at?
You know, really, in my mind, I can see both instances being called for. You know, maybe it's just, and there again, it depends on the weaker brother. Maybe that weaker brother is, you know, it's not going to destroy him if I just refrain from eating meat when he's in my presence, or eating pork or whatever. But maybe it's going to destroy him if he knows that I do that. You know, it really depends on the weaker brother, I would say, in my opinion. Now, someone else may have a different view of that, but you know, the goal here is not to destroy this other brother, and whatever it takes to do that, we need to be willing to go there.
This passage, I think, addresses that issue. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. Earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. If any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner, and you desire to go eat whatever is set before you, asking no question for conscience sake, but that's key, as Paul goes on to say. But if anyone says this was offered to an idol, don't eat it, although it's okay to eat it, for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? And he goes on to explain, but I think that addresses at least an aspect.
You're looking at the different situation, situation by situation. You're making a judgment call there.
And it would be the case in anything that, in matters of not sin, but not to offend that brother, it could be some other subject or
so, some other subject. You know, if you're invited over to someone's house, then you know they don't eat pork or meat or whatever, you don't take hot dogs. You know what I mean? And when they, you know, but you know, you just judge on a case by case basis. Yes.
It might depend upon whether or not it offended the weak brother when you eat it, he wasn't in your presence.
Yeah.
Paul said, if it makes my brother to offend, I will eat no meat while the world thing.
Yeah.
I think it would depend upon the effect that it had upon the weak brother.
Yeah. So that's, you know, if, you know, he's giving us the extreme there. You know, I'll never eat meat again if that's what it takes. And so if that's what it takes, then that's the extent we need to go to. But it may not take that.
Sounds like Paul's talking about all the time. He said, ever, you know.
Yeah. And like I said, that may be the extent we have to go to. In order to keep, you know, the goal here is what? To keep from destroying our brother, to edify, you know, do things that edify. And if that's what it takes, then that's the extent we need to be willing to go to. Go ahead, Dave.
Go ahead, Rod.
I was just going to say, we hadn't mentioned him, but the weaker brother, and again, this isn't in conflict with anything we said. I do think the stronger brother has a burden he's discussed, but the weaker brother, which is what I was dealing with on trying to make sure that they don't judge the strong brother.
Yeah.
That's what, you know, Paul says that. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats. And so the young, you know, a lot of times the weaker, younger, maybe person or whatever, he may not understand he can eat meat. What he can understand is what Paul said. Now, don't you judge this brother that's eating meat. If you want to eat it or not eat it, that's fine. But now don't judge him. God's accepted him. You need to understand that.
Yeah. So we have really sin on both sides of the issue there. David.
let me see if I can ask this right. What if the person would have to be sincere, what he said about eating meat or not eating meat? What if for a reason, and I think I've seen a handful of them over the years where people say, well, I don't think you should do this because it offends me. What if it doesn't really offend him? What if he's using that as maybe a way to get back at you? I mean, what do you do there? I mean, if you really know, if you know the person and you know why he's saying that, and I don't think anyone here, I'm just,
I don't know, that's a tough call.
no, it is.
I mean, I know what, we should be willing to do, but, that judgment call there, I don't know.
To do the right thing as a Christian, I'd say that's what we'd say, okay, well, it'll be judgment to do. Maybe he's asking with some other thing in mind. Maybe not. I mean, if it really offends, I think we would know that. But if it didn't, I think we probably know that too. But maybe we'll go ahead and do it.
Anything else?
That's still one of the greatest problems.
Yeah, I mean, and we'll get into that in a little bit as well, or probably next week, as far as, you having somebody holding you hostage, so to speak, and we can't allow that. But that's fine.
I just asked a question.
That's fine. I like being on the spot. So the question that I'd like to ask as well is, well, who is this weak brother? And we kind of hit just a little bit. We need to understand who the weak brother is. It's not necessarily one who is weak in their belief or weak in their zeal. Oftentimes when we think of a weak brother, we think of someone who's maybe a little shaky on their faith or on the gospel, their belief in the gospel, maybe their belief in God. That's kind of where we go to when we think of someone that's weak. But the weak brother in this instance, I don't think is necessarily there. I think on the outside, they seem very zealous. You're looking at someone maybe that's very strong in their belief and the way they understand the scriptures or whatever. So on the outside, this person, in some ways would be strong. Maybe their fortitude and things like that. But the stand that they are taking is because of their zeal and their desire to serve God. And sometimes we think of a weak brother as someone maybe that's weak in their desire to serve God. But that's not what we're talking about here. We have someone who maybe is strong in their desire to serve God. You look at verse 6. It says, he who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he who gives God thanks, and he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks. And so, we see in this passage where you have both people endeavoring to serve the Lord. So, they're not weak in that they're falling away from necessarily serving God. They're weak more or less in their understanding. As we said, they have strong convictions. On the outside, they may appear to be a person of great fortitude and strength. But what this person is one who does not have a full understanding of the gospel. You look in verse 14. It says, I know and am convinced by the Lord Jesus that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him who considers anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. And so here, this weak brother, even though he has a strong conviction and belief in God and desire to serve God, lacks an understanding. Paul says, I know and I'm convinced this is true that there's nothing unclean, but this brother does not have that understanding. And therefore, that's the weak brother. In verse 23, but he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because he does not eat from faith, for whatever is not from faith is sin. And so here again, this is someone that's doubting, that doesn't have this conviction, this full understanding. And so therefore, this is the weak brother. Or it could be, the weak, the person judging someone, as Rodney was saying too. We've got weak on either side. But, that desire, I believe, to serve God and to live faithfully is there, I believe, on both sides. It's just the understanding that is not there. In defining doubts, as used in verse 23, Vine says the verb suggests not so much weakness of faith as lack of it. So while the faith that they have there is strong, they need to add to it a little more. They need to a little better understanding of the gospel. Because you look at that definition, you think, well, that's, maybe that doesn't really make sense. But the more you think about it, I think it does, and I think it applies to this situation here. And then you may have one, and as we get into, the idea of the conscience and things, pertaining to that, you have one whose faith is weak in their own action. There again in verse 23, this person who is doubting about eating, yet he's going ahead and eating anyway. And so while his faith in God is great, maybe his faith in what he is actually doing, his own actions, he's wavering on that. And so I think it's good for us to have an understanding of who this weak brother is and, what he may look like. Because it may be, an older person that's, you just never know who it would be. And it may not on the outside appear, we wouldn't normally call this person weak, I guess is what I'm saying there.
There's people that I know are stronger than I am, whatever that would mean, but they think it's wrong to celebrate Christmas in any form.
Yeah.
Now, I know they're stronger as a Christian, no more, but I consider them the weaker brother on that point because I actually think you can observe a day to yourself if you choose to within the, without.
And that's a good and I thought of that application, as far as how can we apply these things today? You can apply it to someone who's a vegetarian, someone who is celebrating Christmas as not necessarily a religious holiday, but just as a
so it's not about their faith in the sense of whether they're stronger, because I know some, I consider them stronger than, more learned and stronger than me, and yet they hold this view. I think that just on that point, I consider them the weaker brother.
So those are good applications, I think, for us to take away from here. And I think that's what we're looking at as far as the type of problems we're trying to solve with Romans chapter 14 there. The next section here, we're going to be looking at dealing with the conscience, and we won't get finished with this section. But, chapter 14, as well as there's several other passages, deal with the conscience, and the conscience is very important. It's a valuable thing for the Christian. And, we could probably spend 2 or 3 classes talking about the conscience because it's very important. And we must train our conscience. We can't just, expect our conscience to be a good guide when we're not training it properly. And, all of those things come into play when we're looking at the conscience, and we're not really going to get into all of that. But we need to understand how we deal with our conscience and how important our conscience is. The first thing that we need to understand is we are not to violate our conscience. Do that which we are able to do with full conviction. Look at, the last part of verse 5. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. And so anything that we do or that we practice, we don't need to be doing that if we cannot be fully convinced that this is something that I'm authorized to do. And so let each be fully convinced. We are to refrain from doing anything about which we have doubts. Verses 22 and 23, do you have faith? Have it to yourself before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. But he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because he does not eat from faith, for whatever is not from faith is sin. Whatever is not from faith is sin. And so, and this next week, I'd like for you to think about this concept of violating our conscience. Here you have this thing that is not sin, but yet it is sin. Why does God say, well, now it's a sin? What's the purpose behind that? Why is it such a bad thing for us to violate our conscience? Why does it turn things that are not sin into sin? What's the concept behind that? Do you understand what I'm asking? Why does it turn it into sin? And you look at the conscience and this idea of violating the conscience and what it trains us to do. And so we're going to talk about that, Lord willing, in a little more detail next week. So next week, if you want to go ahead and keep the outlines that you have here, we'll continue on with chapter 14. We're going to get a little more in depth in the conscience and, as we said, the importance of the conscience and, answer maybe some of those questions. If you have other things that you'd like to bring up, we'll do that as well. I appreciate all the comments and the questions that we've had this morning. I feel like we've had a good discussion, and I do appreciate all that. So we'll go ahead and swap things over. It will take us just a few minutes, and then we'll go right into our song service.